Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. I always look forward to coming back to Lithuania. I've been coming back now for, I think, the last 4 years. Every year I spend about a week in Lithuania. So it's my great pleasure. And of course, last year was a most outstanding time for me in Lithuania because we planted 50 oak trees in the Kaunas Botanical Garden, and also I believe it was last year that I was invested as an honorary doctor in this great university. And now I'm back here again, and I am absolutely thrilled because my book, Reflections of Eden, has been translated into the Lithuanian language. And this is, I think, the 10th language that it has been translated into. There may be more languages that I'm not aware of. So I'm sort of getting back to the Reflections of Eden. So sometimes I discover that the book has been translated and I didn't even know about it. So somebody asked me about doing a Spanish translation, and I said, no, the book has never been translated to Spanish. And then the person inquired and discovered, yes, it had been translated into Spanish many years ago. But nobody bothered to inform us. So Reflections of Eden is not an academic book. It is basically my autobiography. But as it was published in 1995 and written between 1990 and 1995, it basically only covers the first 20 years of my work with orangutans. I have spent 41 years working with orangutans in Indonesia. And in this book, I had to fight with my original publisher about the role of orangutans in the book, because what happened is the publisher, the American publisher, actually took out several chapters that were dedicated to orangutans. Anyway, so I'm stressing the point that this is not an academic book, but nonetheless, much of it is about orangutans. And so I think anybody who reads this book is going to get a very strong feeling of who and what orangutans are. So who are the orangutans? The orangutans are great apes. They are very closely related to us. They share 97% of their genetic material with us. They are not as closely related to us as chimpanzees and gorillas are. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. They share almost 99% of their genetic material with us. We can get blood transfusions from a chimpanzee and vice versa once blood groups are matched. Orangutans are very different from chimpanzees and gorillas. Orangutans are very, how should I put it, are semi-solitary. They're not gregarious. And they are the creatures that we left behind when we left the Garden of Eden. Now I say this as an allegorical kind of statement, not necessarily as a factual statement, but still it's very, very true. If we look at the origin story of our culture, of Western culture, which of course is based on ancient Hebrew, I don't want to call it stories, it's amazing how that story as an allegory fits so well. So being started out in the tropical rainforests of this earth. And once those tropical rainforests began to diminish because of the change in climate, our ancestors were forced or were left the tropical rainforests and emerged onto the savannas of Africa. The creatures that were left behind were the ancestors that we shared with the orangutans. So we're talking about why I chose the title, Reflections of Eden. And again, it has to do with the fact that we human beings originated in the tropical rainforests of Africa. And those were the original, that was the original Garden of Eden, if we wish to use an allegory. And we were evicted from that Garden of Eden. But our almost ancestors, who are the orangutans, stayed behind. And as those forests retreated, and as those forests were also found in Asia, once a land connection was made between Asia and Africa about 18 million years ago, those are the creatures, our relatives, who were left behind and who have stayed there for millions of years. But 10 to 14 million years ago, orangutans were also, we shared our ancestors with the orangutans. We had a common ancestor with orangutans. So, this book talks about working with orangutans. It talks about the conservation issues that orangutans and forests face now. The problem for orangutans is that, as I keep saying over and over again, orangutans never left the tropical rainforest. What that means is orangutans never developed a secondary form of adaptation to terrestriality. So they never became knuckle walkers like the chimpanzees and the gorillas of Africa. They never became bipedal like human beings. So in the wild, orangutans spend 95 to 99.9% of their time in the trees. Virtually all their food, which consists mainly of ripe fruit, young leaves, and bark, is found in the canopies of the tropical rainforest. So, without rainforest, which was our original Garden of Eden, orangutans cannot survive into the future. Without rainforests, orangutans are going extinct. And that is the message that I have tried to convey to the Indonesian government and to the Indonesian people, where I have been working 41 years. That is the story that I bring forth in my book, Reflections of Eden. I would actually like to talk a little bit about my scientific work. And I have followed wild orangutans now for over 100,000 hours. I have documented the birth interval of wild orangutans, which is the longest birth interval for any animal in the wild. Orangutans give birth once every 8 to 10 years in the wild, on average, which means that they are very vulnerable to extinction. For an entire lifetime, an orangutan female may only give birth 4 or 5 times. Orangutans are very long-lived. Females do live into their 40s and 50s and continue giving birth. But even so, it doesn't make up for the fact that their birth intervals are so long. And also, wild orangutan females do not give birth for the first time until they are 15 or 16 years of age. So again, this is a very ancient kind of adaptation to a very stable environment. Orangutans do not do well when the habitat is disturbed and they have to come down to the ground to seek food. What happens, of course, is they're being pushed aside because the tropical rainforest is being converted into palm oil plantations. The forest disappears, they become crop raiders, and they get killed. So you have two things going on in Indonesia and Malaysia: the destruction of the forest and the actual killing of orangutans, which is against the law, but nonetheless proceeds and is very common. The other thing about orangutans is they have huge home ranges. So we have, I don't want to say documented, because the evidence is somewhat, circumstantial. You know, we actually have not followed wild orangutan males for hundreds of kilometers, but it appears that wild males use or have home ranges that are over 100 square kilometers in size, over the course of their lifetimes. Females tend to have smaller home ranges, at least in Kalimantan Tengah, where I work, maybe 20 to 30 square kilometers. So what does that tell you? That tells you that if you want to conserve orangutans, if you want to protect wild orangutan populations, you have to also protect a huge, huge areas of forest. It's virtually impossible to protect such large areas of forest. So we have a really big problem. So that's some of my contributions to science, is that I have documented these facts for the orangutans of central Kalimantan, which Kalimantan being Indonesian Borneo. The other interesting thing about orangutan adaptations is that the productivity of the forest seems to change from the eastern part of orangutan range to the western part. So in the eastern part of Borneo, you have orangutans that are relatively small, and their brain sizes are significantly smaller than the brain sizes of the orangutans that are found in central Borneo. And this is an amazing thing when you think about it. And what it suggests is that ecology can actually affect brain size directly. The orangutans of eastern Borneo also have shorter birth intervals, and they tend to be more solitary. When you get to Sumatra, you get very productive forests, with very tall canopies, perhaps a slightly more extensive distribution of fruit trees. And what you get there is very interesting. You get orangutans that are living in a sort of a paradise for orangutans, and these orangutans are the ones that are going extinct the quickest, because they're not as gritty as the orangutans of East Borneo and Central Borneo. And so in Sumatra, where I've personally not done much field work, but where I have had Indonesian students do field work, there are less than 7,000 orangutans left. So the Sumatran orangutans are on the verge of extinction. So I've talked enough. I could talk for hours. I can talk about all kinds of things relating to orangutans, relating to the great apes, relating to Borneo and Sumatra, relating to Indonesia, but I would very much prefer to answer questions. The hardest moments? Well, I think physically it was very, very hard. Physically it's very difficult to follow orangutans. It's actually amazing that there are people who have studied orangutans. I've studied them for 41 years, but the swamps, they're creatures of the lowlands, they're creatures of the swamps. The highest densities of orangutans, both in Borneo and Sumatra, are found in the swamps. So it's very, very difficult. I would wake up before dawn, it was black out there, and then my clothes would still be wet from the previous day's follow, and then I would go into the swamps up to my waist, sometimes up to my armpits, into the acidic waters of peat swamp forest, and you'd get allergies. It was cold, even though we were 2 degrees south of the equator. So the physical hardships in the early days were really quite outstanding. And 41 years ago, Indonesia was very different than it is now. 41 years ago, Indonesia, especially Indonesian Borneo, was still a technologically and economically different place. It was very difficult to get food, for instance. All we had to eat was white rice. Not that I remember my former husband would sometimes not eat for 3 days so that he could get back his taste for white rice. So physically it was very, very hard. I was covered with tropical ulcers. My former husband had purple tropical ulcers on his legs that were, this deep. and he couldn't get rid of them for years. And then he went back to North America, and they disappeared in a matter of days. And the reason was because of the high humidity and always being in those swamps with their acidic waters. So physically, it was very, very hard. But I think even harder was the fact that orangutans were going, or are going extinct, and we had to fight. I don't want to say fight. I don't know how to explain it, but there was always this feeling, and we were always having to go to government offices. We were always, it seemed that I spent as much time in government offices as I did in the swamps, actually following orangutans. So, and there were some terrible times, and really terrible times I can't even talk about. But with the support of the Indonesian government, we were able to withstand those times. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the struggle against illegal logging. We had illegal loggers that came into the national park. We had to struggle against those illegal loggers, and it was a very difficult time. The Indonesian government, bless them, actually gave me 2 police sergeants. And these 2 police sergeants were with me for 2.5 years. 2.5 years. Everywhere I went, there was an Indonesian police sergeant with a gun. And the only places where they didn't follow me were into the bathroom and into the bedroom. So that was a very, very difficult time. Very, very difficult. And the fight now is against palm oil, concessions and palm oil. But the palm oil companies are corporations. They tend to try and follow the law as much as possible. So they're a much bigger threat to orangutan existence as species, but at the same time, the fight against palm oil is totally a different kind of fight. The fight against the illegal loggers was very much a fight on the ground. So thank you to the Indonesian government, because the Indonesian government provided me with 2 police officers for 2.5 years to guard me and to protect me. So that tells you, I didn't ask for it. The Indonesian government gave me those police officers. So I'm very, very grateful to the Indonesian government for doing that, because they physically protected me. But the fact that they did this already tells you about the difficulties that we were having in the field. And it was just as much bureaucratic difficulties as the physical difficulties that I talked about.
How likely is it that the domesticated population of orangutans could survive? I mean, are they at all adaptable to zoos, given the big range that they have to cover and the space they need?
There are several hundred. Thank you for the question. There are several hundred orangutans in North American zoos, and there's probably 100 or more in European zoos. So the problem with orangutans going extinct is not the individuals going extinct. Like the passenger pigeons went extinct, I believe in, what year was it, 1914 or 1918? The problem is orangutan populations as populations in the wild. So I think we will probably have orangutans as individuals in zoos. Orangutans actually breed relatively well in zoos. But the problem is that they cannot evolve in zoos. They lose their native cultures, they lose their native behaviors, and they lose, of course, their native ecologies. So when you see an orangutan in a zoo, it's not the same as seeing a population of orangutans in the wild. To be a biologically viable population of orangutans is estimated that you need about 5,000 to 6,000 orangutans. And so one of the achievements of my life that is, partially documented in this book is that we were able to save the population of Tanjung Puting National Park to the point where 6,000 orangutans, the 6,000 orangutan member population that was there in 1971 is still there. The individuals have changed, while all around much larger orangutan populations have gone extinct. So when I went to Borneo in 1971, there were orangutan populations that were 20, 30,000 in size. And the population that I worked with, which was about 6,000, was just a small population. It was a nothing population. Barbara Harrison, who was then the world's expert on orangutans, because only she had seen orangutans or worked with orangutans in the wild, told me that if she was doing surveys in Sarawak, where she was based, she wouldn't even have bothered to survey the river on which Camp Leakey sits. She wouldn't even have bothered. It was such a small population. Well, that small population, 40 years later, is the world's largest wild orangutan population in the world. And it's one of the few wild orangutan populations that will survive in perpetuity if conditions remain the same. And that is the population that I work with in Tanjung Puting National Park. So yes, orangutans can survive as individuals. They mate and they reproduce well in zoos, but that's not really what we're interested in. I mean, we want to save the wild populations. Yes?
How Lithuanians may help orangutans to survive?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking it. I think how Lithuanians can...
What was the question?
The question was, kaip lietuviai gali padėti, orangutangams išgyvent, not go extinct, yeah? It's a wonderful question. Nešnykt. It's a wonderful question, and I think Lithuanians can do it by first being aware on the international scale. So, for instance, a few years ago, maybe it was even last year, I spoke to a Lithuanian representative to the European Union Parliament, and we talked about green energy, and we talked about biofuels, and we talked about palm oil. And palm oil has been suggested or indicated as a biofuel. And so but of course palm oil is one of the greatest threats to orangutan survival, and also in terms of global climate change, it's the establishment of palm oil plantations that makes Indonesia the third largest emitter of carbon into the world's atmosphere. So after China, after the United States, it's Indonesia, right? And that's because of all the forests and the peat below those forests that are being burnt to clear the forest for palm oil. So I forget the lady's name. She was very young, at least compared to me. And she went to Brussels, or wherever the European Parliament is located, and she voted against palm oil being used as a biofuel in the European Union. So that's the first thing. That vote may not have carried the day, but it's important. So I think Lithuania can play a role in the international world, or in the international stage, of being aware of the harm that palm oil is doing to orangutans. The other good thing about Lithuania is there are no orangutans here, right? So another thing that Lithuania can do, the Lithuanian government can do, is establish, what is that? I'm sorry, I'm tired. I've spent the last 2 days on planes. There is a policy about great apes, giving great apes rights. And I think 2 countries have voted this in, and one of them is Spain, and the other one I think is New Zealand. I think it's the great apes' rights. I forget the exact name. So all the great apes deserve rights. The second thing that Lithuanians can do is they can go and volunteer. And this is one of the reasons that I'm speaking here, is that I hope that we can find students who are willing to go and do research on wild orangutans and volunteer as students or just simply as volunteers to help orangutans in the wild. So we've been very fortunate. We've had 3 Lithuanian volunteers. Now we have dozens of volunteers from other countries, but we've had 3 Lithuanian volunteers, one of which shares my last name, Birutės Galdikas. He was a 19-year-old volunteer. Unfortunately, he went to Norway. And we had another Lithuanian volunteer. She immigrated to the United States. And then we had a 3rd Lithuanian volunteer, and she was funded by the Birutė Galdikas Ecology and Support Foundation, and she spent several months working as a vet with our orphaned orangutans, of which we have 335, and now I'm told she's in Sweden. It's an interesting commentary on the Lithuanian situation. Anyways, we hope that we have more Lithuanian volunteers. This is one way that Lithuanians can really help. You know, somebody introduced me a few hours ago as almost Lithuanian, which I thought was interesting. How would you say it in Lithuanian? Bent Lietuviška, almost Lithuanian, right? Beveik Lietuvė, yeah. Said to me, beveik Lietuvė, yeah, almost Lithuanian. Well, genetically, as far as I know, I'm 100% Lithuanian, so. So I think, and culturally, I'm quite a bit Lithuanian because I think my love of forests and my love of nature came from my Lithuanian or even Baltic background, because when I was a child in Canada, my best friends were all Lithuanian and Estonian. So I share that commonality. And I have to tell you, the Estonians really have a very close relationship with nature. But Lithuanians do too. So my love of forest definitely came from my Lithuanian background. And I would very much like it if the person who took over my work, or among the people who take over my work, is somebody from Lithuania. I actually have, among some of my strongest supporters and students, is actually a Russian from Siberia. But it would be so nice that that Lithuanians would get involved in my work. And so I'm hoping that there will be Lithuanian volunteers, perhaps Lithuanian students, who carry on the work and help me. So that's, I think, the best way is through the volunteers. And of course the last way is to donate funds. And maybe this can't be done through the Lithuanian public, but perhaps it can be done through the Lithuanian government. I had an interesting encounter about 2-3 years ago with the Lithuania's foreign minister, whose name I've forgotten. He is no longer foreign minister. And I said, well, why can't the Lithuanian government, it's a foreign aid program, say give $10,000 to the orangutans with which I work? And you know what he said? Can I say it? He said, it's all going to Afghanistan. So, I don't know. So we had an interesting talk about the importance of Afghanistan to Lithuania. And you can imagine what my viewpoint is, working in the jungles of Borneo. We need to save the jungles of Borneo, not just for orangutans, but also for all humankind. Because global climate change is a problem for all of us, no matter where we are or who we are. And until those Bornean forests stop being destroyed, not only will orangutans in the wild go extinct, but also people in the rest of the world will feel the effects. So I hope that answered your question. And if anybody else can give me a better answer, I would very much like to hear it. Because I think it's significant. I think Lithuanians can really help. I think Lithuanians, from my understanding of Lithuanian culture, Lithuanian history, have a very close relationship to nature. I remember when I was a child reading a poem, a Lithuanian poem, about, and I don't know if anybody can tell me who this poem was by, I'd really appreciate it. It said, the Lithuanian and the forest stood together, and when the forest was annihilated, the Lithuanian would be annihilated. It's a long, long poem. I remember it just went on. It was like a little book. Do you know who the poet was? Was that him? Baranauskas, yeah. And what was the name of the poem? Yeah, I'll have to look it up. I'll have to get a copy of that poem. Yeah. Well, that poem had a very strong effect on me about the importance of the forest. Are there any more questions? Yes? Okay. Aš suprantu. Nekalbu, bet suprantu. Gorillas. Oh, yes, okay.
Ir norėjau paklausti, ar tas filmas atspindi tą visą jūsų darbą ir norėjau paklausti, kokie ryšiai jūs siejo su tuo žmogumi, pagal kurį buvo pastatytas filmas. Jeigu teisingai paklausti.
Diane Fossey's work? Yeah. Okay. Yes?
Ir ar šitas filmas labai yra panašus su jūsų kasdienybė?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, Diane Fossey and I shared the same mentor. The person who raised the funds for me to go to Borneo was Louis Leakey, and part of my inspiration in asking him, approaching him, and asking him for his support was that I heard a lecture, and in this lecture, during the question and answer period, he mentioned the fact that he had received a telegram from Diane Fossey. So after I heard this, I knew that he was the person I should approach. So I got to know Diane when I was in London with Louis Leakey and Jane Goodall. And, I've always regarded her as my older sister. Not so much my academic sister, but my older sister. And Diane was very supportive of what I was going to do in Borneo. As to the film, Diane worked in Africa. And Africa is very much a different place than Indonesia. So, the Indonesians are very gracious, warm, and kind people. And what happened to me in Indonesia concerning the illegal loggers never was personal. It was like you might meet these people on the street, in the town, and they would still smile and say hello to you. Even though, they were coming into the park with machetes and, and destroying, and chainsaws and destroying the park. So the film is not directly indicative of the kinds of conditions that I faced. I also married an Indonesian. I have now been married for 33 years to a Dayak elder, even though he's younger than me, in Borneo. And we have 2 children. I have one child with my former husband, who's Canadian. So I've always had a very warm kind of acceptance in Indonesia. 3 days ago, maybe it was 4, the president of Indonesia himself and the Minister of Forestry opened my film, which is called Born to be Wild, but it's an IMAX 3D film, so it can't be shown in Lithuania because there's no IMAX theaters here. So, they've given me all kinds of awards. And I mentioned the 2 police officers that they provided for 2.5 years. So I've always had a very warm relationship with Indonesia. And I'm not quite sure that Diane had a similar, I think her relationship with the Rwandans might have been slightly different, I don't know. So I'm very happy to work in Indonesia. But again, the bureaucracy, it's like strangles you, and the problem is that, if you are trying to prevent people from making $100 million from illegal timber, and they're trying to get rid of you, it's nothing personal. It's about the money. Okay. Any other questions? Yes? Oh, and it can't be shown in Lithuania because it's an IMAX film. Yeah, formatos IMAX. Yeah. So it's. I mentioned. I have people who have been to Siberia recently. Whatever the biggest city in Siberia is, and that film is being shown there right now because they have an IMAX theater.
Ar Indonezijos policija populiarina turizmą, pavyzdžiui, taip yra dabar Afrikoje, taip pasakyti, ar jie supranta, kad turizmas gali nemažesnės pajamas atnešti negu tas palmių plantacijos.
Could you
Indonesian government that tourism plays economy.
Yes, that's a very good question. Yes, the tourism we have always supported tourism in our area. So anybody is free to visit Camp Leakey, where I work, not the other facilities which are closed to the public, but Camp Leakey is inside a national park. We have always encouraged tourism to this national park. In fact, we just negotiated for a cruise ship to come into Kumai Bay, and the tourists, the passengers on that cruise ship, to go to Camp Leakey. The problem with palm oil is that palm oil is so huge that tourism, you'd have to have mass tourism in the place where I work to replace the effect of palm oil. Rwanda is a small country. It's very poor. Guerrilla tourism has become a very important earner of foreign exchange. But what are we talking about when we talk about palm oil? Indonesia next year is going to become one of the few countries on this planet whose gross national product will exceed $1 trillion. I think it'll be one of 10 nations on this planet. Of the 10 richest people in Indonesia, all of whom are billionaires, 9 of them made their money in palm oil. And the other one made his money in tobacco. And he just sold his tobacco firms to Marlboro in the United States and has now gone into palm oil. So the problem is that we're talking about a very rich country, even though it's considered third world, and the amount of money that palm oil is making for Indonesia is just horrendous. If you get a palm oil concession, it's like getting a license to print money. We have been advised, and the international conservation community has discussed, that perhaps conservationists should buy palm oil plantations, run them, and use the enormous profits for conservation. I mean, that's what we're talking about. But yes, absolutely. Tourism will not replace palm oil where we are, but tourism diversifies the economy. It also produces a constituency that wants to protect orangutans in national parks and forests. So it's very useful, and we do the most we can to impact it and increase it. So one of the things that people can do, each and every one of you, is go to Indonesia. Visit the orangutans. If you want to help the great apes, go to Africa. Like I did. I went to Rwanda simply to visit the great apes. I was before I went to Indonesia, I visited Jane Goodall, saw the chimpanzees, but Diane Fossey was not in Rwanda when I was in Africa in 1971, so I decided it would be impolite to go to her camp, and tourism then was not as developed as it is now. So people can go to Indonesia, people can go to Africa, see the great apes, and make it very clear to the local people and the local governments that for you, the protection of great apes, the existence of great apes and their habitats is very important. So we're already getting Lithuanian tourists. We've had several groups come, in addition to the 3 Lithuanian volunteers. And so far we haven't had any groups from Latvia or Estonia. So I think it has something to do with the connection that we have with Lithuania. Yeah, all the great apes are going extinct. It's not just orangutans. I mean, bonobos, less than 50,000 left, nobody knows. Chimpanzees, they used to be in 23 different countries. They're now extinct in at least 2 of those. Gorillas, we thought that the western lowland gorilla was safe. No. So it's all the great apes, not just the orangutans. Any more questions? I saw some hands in the back earlier. Well, there must be some questions. Yes?
We have one more.
Yes, Bayatru?
How about natural predators, other than humans? Are any animals in the rainforest that would endanger orangutans?
Yes, there are. Thank you. The question has been asked about natural predators. We recently had a wild-born ex-captive female killed by a crocodile and partially eaten. So in the wild, probably crocodiles are natural predators, especially since orangutans have no fear of water. They generally do not swim. And when I say generally, a year ago I would have said they do not swim. But since then, there's evidence of an orangutan in the wild who was swimming, and there's video. There's video of a captive orangutan in South Carolina who swims. Now he swims in a swimming pool, and he has a life jacket on, but he actually swims. So most orangutans do not swim, although a few do. But orangutans do cross rivers. They go into the water, up to their nostrils in the swamps, and it's not surprising that crocodiles will take them. The other predators might be clouded leopards. A clouded leopard might take a juvenile, but not a fully grown adult. And pythons. Pythons still kill people in Indonesia and Malaysia, so it might not be surprising if they killed an occasional orangutan. And in Sumatra, you have tigers. And tigers are mainly terrestrial predators. And so one of the interesting things about the difference between Sumatran and Bornean orangutans is that Sumatran orangutans are almost always arboreal, while the Bornean orangutans are more likely to come down to the ground. And people have hypothesized that this is because of the presence of tigers in Sumatra. Orangutans are killed for food by the Dayaks even now, and orangutans are killed as pests, agricultural pests and palm oil plantations. There was a big scandal recently when it was discovered that a Malaysian palm oil company in East Borneo, Indonesia, was paying their employees $110 for each orangutan that they killed. $110 is a lot of money in Indonesia. It would be a month's wage, maybe. So for some people, and it turned out that in the last few years, employees of that Malaysian palm oil company had killed 750 orangutans and other protected wildlife and were paid for it by the company. So, I mean, that's the problem. It's not just forest destruction, it's also orangutans are directly killed. And if you remember, I mentioned that orangutan females only start giving birth when they're 15 or 16 years of age. The birth interval is between 8 to 10 years on average. So if you start killing orangutans, the wild population is not going to jump back like it would if they were rabbits. And the police, now the other interesting thing is, it's totally against the law in Indonesia but the Indonesian police, this happened a few months ago, that knowledge of this outrage was known or came out into the open, and the Indonesian police are still investigating this.
Ir Indonezijos policija vis dar tai tyria.
No action has been taken, but the newspapers are like on fire about this. So this is one of the problems, is that Indonesian culture does not like confrontation, that it's not a confrontation-oriented society. And my kids actually make fun of me. And do you know what they say to me in Indonesia? This is my children, my grown-up children. What do you think they say? They say, "Stop being so Lithuanian." In other words, direct, forward, saying what I think. Yes?
How did you divide your time and attention between raising children and orangutans?
Well, I was very fortunate because I think it's because I was very fortunate in the men that I married. So, I'm sorry?
He was the nanny?
I have my first husband, after our divorce, he took our son to Canada. And so he basically raised my first son. And then my second husband, to whom I've been married 33 years, I was married to my first husband for 14 years. So I was married very young. My second husband, was just an excellent father and very much shared the child rearing duties. And also I was very fortunate when it came for my children to go to school in the United States. My parents helped me. My parents took care of my children. So my daughter started going to school in the United States in grade 6. And then my son started going to school in the United States in grade 10. And so when I was in Indonesia, they lived with my parents. And I lived with my parents too when I came to the States. So I was very fortunate that I was very close to my parents and lived with them until they died. So it was basically my husband and my parents. Without them, I could not have done it. I would have had to go back to North America. That my parents, when I was in Indonesia, my parents would take care of my 2 younger children so they could go to school in the United States. But, my middle son went to public school in Indonesia until junior high school. So he didn't start going to school in the United States until grade 10. And it was a seamless move because he didn't even have to go to, English as a second language courses, because his English was so good. So one of the things that I always did is I always spoke English to my children, even in Indonesia. So they were both, native speakers of English and Indonesian, because English is so important.
Did you taught your children Lithuanian language?
It's an interesting question. And my children know some Lithuanian, but I forget whether it was my son or my daughter actually accused me. They said, "Well, why didn't you teach us Lithuanian?" Well, and I said, because it was much more important for you to learn English, because English is an international language. And they said, "Well, we would have wanted to speak, Lithuanian with Grandma and Grandpa." So I wish I could have, but it was just too difficult. And I'm going to be taking, very fortunate this time around, I don't know why I didn't think of it before. I've asked to take Lithuanian language lessons because my vocabulary is so small. My problem is that I learned Lithuanian when I was a child, and I spoke Lithuanian as my exclusive language until I was 4 years old. And then when I was about 4.5 years old, I went to kindergarten in Canada. And I remember the very first day I walked into kindergarten, I did not understand a word of what people were saying. But then within days I was speaking English. So my parents, the only person that I almost exclusively spoke Lithuanian to was my father. But my mother learned English very quickly. And then my siblings, of course, learned English very quickly. So I really didn't have an opportunity to speak Lithuanian. I went to Lithuanian Saturday school in Toronto every Saturday until grade 8. I went to school in the Lithuanian language, learned about Lithuanian history, learned about, Catholicism. We were taught by nuns and priests. It was associated with the parish, the Roman Catholic parish, one of the Roman Catholic parishes. So I had some opportunity to speak Lithuanian. But even with my Lithuanian friends in Toronto, we spoke English most of the time. So, but to me, the Lithuanian language is very precious. And I think it's important. So my children actually have been thinking about taking Lithuanian language courses. And my brother, my youngest brother, never really learned Lithuanian when he was a child. And actually he did take Lithuanian language lessons in Los Angeles so he could speak Lithuanian to my parents. Yeah, I mean, I'm very proud of being Lithuanian and genetically, and being able to speak some Lithuanian. And, it's like extinction happens not only to animals and plants, it also happens to cultures and languages. So I think it's very important to maintain the Lithuanian language. With only 3 million speakers in the world, it could actually disappear relatively quickly.
And please recall the most significant moment working with the orangutans to you personally, which could make a big impact to you.
To me?
Yes.
I've had several moments like that, and and basically those moments were when wild orangutans showed an interest, or we connected, not so much with the wild-born ex-captives, but when I was alone in the forest with the wild orangutan. I had one incident where my former husband, Rod Brindamore, and I were sitting close to a male orangutan on the ground, and Rod was taking pictures, and he suddenly ran out of film. So he said, I've got to go back and get some film, back to camp, and he just raced off. And I was left alone with this big, wild, adult male orangutan on the ground. And he was eating termites. And he started coming closer and closer, but he was eating termites, paid no attention to me. And then he walked over to me, and he was, I don't know, a foot. I could have reached out and touched him, but he wasn't facing me, he was facing in this direction. And then he stood there and he long called. And the long call lasted for maybe 1 to 2 minutes. And the long call is a very, very loud vocalization, and so I could feel it vibrating through my body. And didn't even look at me, and then he walked away. And the reason that this made such an impact on me is because it was during maybe my first 2 years that I was in Borneo, and I was totally at his mercy. I mean, he could have done anything he wanted to me. He could have ripped me apart, he could have killed me, but instead he came over and he long called. And when he long called, what he said was, I am very powerful, I am very dominant, respect me. And then he walked away. And just a few minutes, but I can't tell you, I felt like I was in the presence of God. There was just something so awesome about this magnificent animal who could have ripped me to shreds, and yet all he said to me was, I'm powerful, I'm dominant, respect me, and walked away. And so I've had several other moments like that with wild orangutans. There's a moment that I describe in my book, And I also have a picture, one picture, and that is when a wild orangutan came down and stared at me right into my eyes for about a minute, half a minute to a minute. And that's one of the things that orangutans do to you, is they come up to you, sometimes even take your hands, and they pull you to them, and they just stare into your eyes without blinking, and they're saying, "Who are you?" And they look as though right into your very soul. And this is when people become very connected to them. And this happens to visitors to Camp Leakey and other places, other of our facilities. So I've had those moments with wild orangutans. Orangutans that normally I couldn't get within 20 feet of. You know, they come down and they just look at you. And they look right into your soul. And, you know, again, you feel like you're in the presence of God. I mean, that impact is so strong. And it also tells you about their character, and you know how strong their character is as well. So those are the moments. They're not very dramatic. You know, other people have very dramatic moments, but to me, when they're actually trying to understand who you are.
Basically, how do these orangutans react to the human presence? Are they scared of humans because of the killings you mentioned, or do they actually become urbanized and start depending on humans to survive? How do they, because I'm kind of confused now, are they afraid of humans? Do they all just come up to them and stare in the eyes, or are they scared?
Okay, the question has been asked. The questioner is a little confused about what is the relationship of orangutans to humans. Wild orangutans are actually very skittish of humans. The problem is that they are not fast. Even in the trees, unless it's a swamp, sometimes humans can keep up with them when an orangutan runs away. If you race an orangutan on the ground, on level ground, a human can run as fast as an orangutan. So orangutans are very shy. In the days when there was vast forests in Borneo, people actually rarely saw orangutans because orangutans were in the tops of the trees. Now, more and more, orangutans have to cross roads. You know, the forests are disappearing, so the relationship has changed. The reason that interaction that I mentioned, where the wild orangutan came down and looked me in the eyes, and Rod Brindamore was able to get one photograph, is because we had been following that orangutan. We'd been following her, I forget, for a week, and close to a week. Or maybe it was several days at the time, I forgot, because this incident took place many, many years ago. So she wanted to know who we were and why we were following her, because she'd never had that experience before. It was an adolescent female. So she came down, and we know her still. But, you know, she came down and she was trying to figure us out. The real relationship between orangutans and humans is that orangutans are afraid of people. They run, they hide. But unfortunately, because the forest is being destroyed, there's no place to run, there's no place to hide. And that is the tragedy. And that's why orangutans are being killed much more than they were before, because the forest is gone. They're basically left naked, no place to go. So thank you for that question. And one more thing. I just want to say that the situation in some places is so bad. In Malaysia, for instance, where the forests have been destroyed, that wild orangutans, you know, these are creatures that 30 years ago you would never see, are now raiding human garbage dumps on the edges of villages. I mean, that's how badly the situation has deteriorated.
Padėkokim Birutei už tą paskaitą.